Hey, welcome to Bible and Archaeology Live. I'm Jordan Jones.
I'm Bob Cargill, and we just want to welcome you back to Friday Free for All.
Friday free
This
for
is
all. So today we're doing things a little bit differently for everybody that's joining in. Today we have no real set topic. This is about questions that you have that you want answered. So we've got a couple questions that have been submitted in advance. We're going to do some news, but a lot of the time is just going to be spent answering questions that are there in the chat. So if you have questions about things as they go along, if you have questions that are completely off topic, put them in the chat, and as we go through, we'll be paying attention there and coming around to your questions. But Bob, how are you feeling about a free for all today?
I'm excited about this. I have been wanting to do this. We do this a lot when people send in questions, but to dedicate an entire hour to just people's questions that have come in either via email to me directly, to you directly. We get a lot of questions on our YouTube comments, and then we get a lot of questions on previous Bible and Archaeology Live. We also get people that are joining our Patreon. Again, please feel free to sign up, support us via Patreon. That's patreon.com/excavator, XKV8R.
And that link is
You
in
can
the
all,
description too.
yes, that link is in the description. And you can go over to, of course, our Bible and Archaeology website, uiowa.edu/BAM, BAM. And you can support us, read about the things that we're talking about here on YouTube over there. And of course, always feel free to support the work that we're doing here.
So let's start with some news, give people some time to drift in. Any questions you already have, go ahead and drop them in the chat. But two news stories from the recent weeks that we want to touch base on, and these are maybe news for discussion. These are less specific news finds, but more how do we feel about these kinds of news stories. So the first one has to do with Greece. Reanalysis of the tombs that are associated with the family of Alexander the Great. So these tombs, they're 4th century BCE. They're identified as royal tombs. They're found in Virginia, not Virginia. They haven't been found at the University of Virginia, but in Virginia. They reanalyzed a study for the Journal of Archaeological Science, reanalyzed the bones using macrophotography, radiographs, and anatomic dissection. And what they were trying to do is using these bones, can we present any arguments for identification here? Historically, these bones have been connected with the bodies of Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, and some of Alexander's family. But this is not typically considered to be the tomb of Alexander the Great himself.
Right.
The results of the study say, yes, we do believe, as has been the tradition, that this is the tomb connected with the family of Alexander, but they do present some different arguments. They want to identify the bones from Tomb 1 with Philip of Macedon. This contradicts the historical view that's identified the bones in Tomb 2. Their basis for this is a wound on the skeleton found in Tomb 1 that they say is consistent with the injuries that we have reported for Philip of Macedon, and that the bones in Tomb 2 match more closely with the stories that we have for King Aridaeus, partially because of cremation, that they say we have this report of cremation and these bones are cremated. So continuing the connection here, but maybe reshuffling who is in what tomb. Bob, what are your thoughts? Does this make much of a change for you, or is this just kind of a scholarly quibbling here about identifications?
It's something that's been reported earlier. I've actually, I don't know if they've aired yet, but I've actually done some documentary interviews about this question. Not about, about, first of all, where is Alexander the Great's tomb? This is
Yeah.
one of those great questions that people are always, people ask, what are some of the big questions that are always out there? Ark of the Covenant and that stuff always comes up. But where's Alexander the Great's tomb? That's one of the fun mysteries. But Philip, his father's tomb, that one they've always kind of said, well, we think it might be here, and based upon this evidence, that is, they've got a place that's likely to be it, and then they look at the remains, and he said to have a limp, right? He had a
Yeah.
hip injury, and so based upon some circumstantial evidence and some direct evidence, they say this is it. And so now they're saying, how can we correct this a little better? It's certainly something to look at. I think it's a legitimate piece of research, and we ought to continue to pay attention to it. The big question is, of course, is this Philip of Macedon's tomb? That would be a wonderful discovery. Is this Alex's family? And if so, was Alexander the Great brought back to this family tomb and buried there? That's
Yeah.
one of the big
That's one of the theories of,
Right,
yeah, with
right.
this disappearing body, or how many times was he buried and moved around. They're not making any claims in this to say that we
No,
found Alexander. They're very much dealing with that within who has been historically associated with this place, but just shuffling the cards a little bit of, we think someone is here who was there. And a part of this I think is interesting of how are we using those new tools to reanalyze those historical claims and finds, because this is something that's still happening with dig reports all the time of redating stratigraphy and continuing to use the new methods that we have to reassess some of the claims that have been made. So I think interesting. I'm sure there will be some rebuttal claims from those who disagree with the arguments. So we'll keep you up to date there. The second story for this week comes from Egypt. And you may have seen some news about this having to do with the Giza pyramids. There is a plan now in place that has already begun to reclad the smaller of the three. So the pyramid of Menkaure, it's the smallest of the three pyramids in the Giza complex, with its granite blocks. Now, originally, they believe it had 16 levels of granite blocks along the bottom of the pyramid, of which currently approximately 7 layers survive depending on the area. The plan is to take the granite blocks from around the pyramid and put them back onto the pyramid. Mustafa Wazari of Egypt's Supreme Antiquities Council is calling this the project of the century. They're interested in returning the pyramid to what they're saying is some of its former viewing glory of what this might have looked like. But obviously there is a little bit of, what should we say, pushback on some of this plan. So we've got a photo here of from a live stream that they had done when they announced this plan. And you can see some of these granite blocks there on the bottom that they're going to put up, and a little graphic of how they're saying they're going to do this. Now, a problem with this is not everyone thinks these blocks necessarily come from this pyramid. There are questions of, did these fall off? The claim here is that these fell off over time naturally or with earthquakes, but others say these could come from many different projects. These could have been moved here at a later date. These could have been unrelated to this pyramid totally, and we might be trying to force these things back on. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes about going forward, but continued developments here as the days go on will be reported to you ongoing. Keep up with us for future updates. But Bob, you have some experience with reconstructions, we could call them digital reconstructions.
right.
Thoughts here with physical, literal reconstructions.
Right. So some people know that I did my dissertation back in 2007 on virtual reconstructions of archaeological sites, and trying to introduce this and demonstrating that this technology, virtual reality, can not only be used to show off, what sites look like for teaching purposes, but can potentially be used in research for testing different theories. Basically, if there are different theoretical reconstructions of a contested site, you can use different virtual reality reconstructions to basically say, okay, here's what it would look like according to this theory. Here's what it would look like according to this theory. And then, of course, in that discussion, there is a subset of discussions about how should one represent theoretical reconstructions.
Right.
So in this argument, some people say, well, in a virtual reconstruction, you should make anything that we're sure about solid, make it look like it really looks, or how it would have looked based on the textures that we have and the stones and the materials that we have. And then anything that's conjectured, anything that's a theoretical reconstruction, that should be transparent. So you should be at 50% transparency, or that should be lime green.
Something
right?
to mark it off.
Yeah, something that, in Israel, when you go to Israel and you look at these archaeological sites, there's the black line. Anybody watching who's been on a tour of an archaeological site or worked on an excavation will go to a site that has now become a tourist site where you can go and look around, and you'll see that the wall has been built up to a particular point, and then there's that black line. And that black line indicates everything above that black line was put back in place. The theory is that we think, based upon the way those stones fell, probably to the foot of that area, those stones probably belong to that wall. They look like the stones. They were discovered right next to it. But to truth be told, and that's what the archaeologists trying to be responsible, everything above this black line was reconstructed. But if you don't know that, it just looks like, oh, look at this big old wall. But everything above that line was put back there. And so how do you represent essentially that black line in virtual reality? And one of the arguments that I made is that we're still thinking in an analog way. You know, when you're doing virtual reconstruction, one thing that we know for sure is that ancient pyramid or that ancient wall or whatever wasn't lime green or it wasn't transparent. So using virtual reality or what we have now with augmented reality, we can actually demonstrate what one scholar thinks it would have looked like and then click a switch and go to what another theory. And at any time, we can click another switch and look at the skeleton, look at the wireframe of what actually sits under there and what's reconstruction. So we can turn on reconstruction on top of wireframe, or we can turn on wireframe on top of reconstruction. It doesn't have to be this old method of, you know, black line and green. So I say all that, and I argued that in my dissertation. That was part of the argument for how to represent remains in virtual reality by actually representing them as they would have looked, and yet using a different method in time, you know, in using the technologies that are available to us using virtual reality, instead of having to do it in a two-dimensional way, in an analog way of, okay, we're only going to do wireframe or we're only going to make it lime green. I say all that so I can say this. It cost a lot of money to do physical reconstructions on an archaeological site, whether it's a little site in Israel, a wall or a palace or whatever, or a huge pyramid. So, and there's an argument to be made that people have become accustomed to the way that the pyramids look, that this has become a part of the experiences. These are the ancient pyramids. To go back now and try to reconstruct them would not only take a lot of time and a ton of money, and who knows, maybe they just want to raise a ton of money so that they can do this, and it's a big project, but that takes a lot of time and a lot of money, and it alters the way it looks permanently because they're going to redo the bottom half of this. Whereas you could go to this brand new museum that they're building. They're the GEM, the Grand Egyptian Museum, and you could out a window looking out at the pyramids, right? You can put next to it a virtual or an augmented reality screen and give people some goggles or have people look at the screen, and you can demonstrate what that reconstruction would have looked like. You're looking at the pyramid now, you're looking at what it would have looked like, and that will cost you a lot less physical labor. You can do it much quicker. There are graduate students and paid professionals out there who can do this now, because, you know, we were working it out even before 2007 when I was doing this. And you can have this experience without actually going out and messing with the actual remains. So if the state of Egypt wants to do this, I mean, they're going to do it, right? They're going to raise the money and
they are actively doing it. Yes.
Yeah. And they're going to physically alter permanently the reconstruction. Or you can, within this grand museum that they've got, use augmented reality. Could you imagine how many tickets you could sell? You know, value add tickets. Mm-hmm. Come here and look at the pyramids. By the way, put these goggles on, and in augmented reality, just click through, and you can see what we think they would have looked like.
It's definitely got some attention immediately, not just from archaeologists, but from the public in general. So we'll keep you up to date on how this proceeds going forward. Let's jump first into a question from the live chat, and then let's go to a pre-submitted question. The first one we have here is regarding the destruction of Solomon's temple. Why is that date 586? Why is the scholarly consensus here that Solomon's temple was destroyed in 586 when that date can be connected to some on Providence tablets is the question.
Yeah. So first of all, the date, if you ever look at the date of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, you'll often see it written at 580 587/586 BC. And this is because a couple of different prominent scholars have argued, based on tying this date to biblical kings and Zedekiah and some of the folks that were there at the time of the multiple. Remember, there's multiple exiles, but of this exile, um, when their reigns took place, and some of them put them at 587, and some of them put it 586. So you'll often see it written 587, 586. I get asked that in class all the time. I read 587, and is it 586? And I was like, well, I won't put both of them on the exam, right? So it's about this time. But the question then becomes, how do we know it's that? And you get this question from two sets of folks. One, why should we rely on the Bible's chronology when the Bible's chronology can be at times problematic in other places? And a lot of people tie this to a chronicle, a Babylonian chronicle. It's not the Stele of Nabonidus. It's a clay tablet that talks about this particular siege. And the question is, it's unprovenanced.
Yeah.
So, Bob, you are a huge advocate of not relying on unprovenanced objects. Again, these ones that were discovered before 73, when they were still forgeries way back then, to be sure. But, why should we rely on a potentially forged, or at least an unprovenanced document for this date? And the answer would be because the date 587, 586 not only aligns with this document, which happens, this chronicle, this tablet that happens to be unprovenanced. Okay, so we can't necessarily rely on that, but it also relies on the Babylonian timeline of kings from when the Neo-Babylonians rebelled against the Neo-Assyrians and took over there, and the reigns of is it Nabopolassar? Nebuchadnezzar II's father. I have to forgot his name real quick. Nabopolassar, and his son Nebuchadnezzar, and then all the way down to Nabonidus, right? So that reign, according to the Babylonian timeline and the Assyrian timeline and the Persian timeline, happens to align with what we have in the biblical up into that 587, 586. So we're using two separate, one outside of the Bible, one inside of the Bible. Now, did some guy come along and forge a document that happens to fit that? We don't know. It's unprovenanced. But that seems to be a pretty good date. There is a religious group that does not accept 587, 586 as the date of the destruction of the temple. But I would argue that group does so for apologetic reasons, because they're trying to argue something else about the destruction of the temple. But 587, 586 is pretty agreed upon date by scholars for the destruction of the temple. And it's not just because it's relying on an unprovenanced tablet.
It's kind of a cross-referencing date that we're reaching across a couple pools here. The safest way to go about things.
Yeah, when you look at what the Persians say about the Persian chronicles about rebelling and taking over the Babylonians, and what the Babylonians say about taking over the Assyrians, the biblical chronology fits pretty tight in there. Plus, you've got these other chronicles. It seems to be a pretty safe date. Now, you can also look at the archaeological destructions at other sites around, let's say, Jerusalem or
right.
These other sites. There was a campaign that came in. We read about this in the Bible. This rebellion and those other archaeological sites seem to line up in a relative dating to this destruction in Jerusalem. It seems to those all line up pretty well as well. So 587, 586. Again, that's the there's a very small margin of people who argue between that short date. That's a pretty reliable date.
I think that's a helpful starting answer here. We've got a super chat question from Joseph Arroyo. Joseph, thank you. This is a two-part question, Bob, so I'll give you part one here and then part two. The first is thoughts on the documentary hypothesis. Now, I'm going to have to make sure I tap the brakes on you so you don't go too long here, but you're a couple minutes. Yeah. What is first, can you give us a definition? What is the documentary hypothesis? And then
Right.
kind of thoughts on the modern state of or feeling about the documentary hypothesis.
Sure. Um, let's start at the very top. The documentary hypothesis is writ large the idea that the not only the Torah, not only the first five books of the Bible, but beyond that, the biblical text, but it's particularly the Pentateuch, or sometimes we talk about the Hexateuch, had multiple authors. Or let's put it this way, that Moses wasn't the sole author of the Torah. Okay.
And the
That
Torah
there
being
were
Genesis, Exodus,
Genesis.
Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Perfect. Thank you. And please, if I say, I try to be very good about defining terms that I use, when I explain it. But if I forget to do that, please jump in. When I was growing up, and even when I went down to Pepperdine to start my, seminary training, my MDiv, when I first learned this, I had a problem with it. And I see here that Joseph says he's currently part of the Church of Christ. For those who don't know, I was raised in this tradition. I had a problem with this because the books of Moses, there's these traditions that Moses wrote it.
Right.
But the more that you study this, the more, A, Moses doesn't write his own death, and B, why are the 10 Commandments given 3 times? Why are there 2 creation accounts? And why doesn't Genesis 1 match up with Genesis 2? And why are there basically 2 flood accounts in Genesis 6 through 9 that are kind of zipped together? And why does Isaiah 36 through 39 match with 2 Kings 18 through 20? Now that's later on, but
there's some internal struggles in the text that's attributed to the single author.
Both within the Pentateuch and the Hexateuch.
Yeah.
Who conquered Jerusalem, right? Was it David, or was it the Israelites when they came in? And yes, we did. No, we didn't. Yes, we did. We've done a separate video on Bible and Archaeology about this. So people began to ask this question. It's been around for thousands of years. And so the documentary hypothesis was established as this idea that there was this Yahwist text, using the divine name of the deity, because these texts used the divine name to describe God. And then there was this E text, this Elohist text, because they only used the name Elohim to describe God. And then there was this priestly text, this P text, and it was only concerned with things that deal with priests. And then, of course, there was Deuteronomy, which became the Deuteronomist text. Now,
oftenly referred to, like you'll hear it JEDP if you're doing some reading.
JEDP.
You'll hear those abbreviated like that. Yeah.
And that was the dominant theory. I want to say it was Wellhausen back in the day. This isn't what I study the most. The guy who's written a book on this recently is Joel Baden.
It's a great book.
Wrote a book about this. He seems to be the one who is focused on this a lot. He does a lot on whatever the heck they're calling Twitter these days, but he talks about these issues a lot. And that's the book that I would refer you to today about these issues. By the way, the arguments changed, right? Was there an E text? Is it a JE text? But what I would say, just writ large, to answer this question quickly, the documentary hypothesis, however it's a real thing. That is, Moses didn't write these books. The Torah that we have today was written by multiple hands. Then it was redacted even later. There's probably a couple of redactions. And then after it was kind of fixed, it continued to be edited well into probably the 1st century, probably even CE. And I talk about that in my Melchizedek book a little bit. But one of the things I had to learn to do when I was at seminary is to accept that the documentary hypothesis was, and again, we can quibble about what texts belong to what, and are these different combinations of texts, but there were multiple strands, multiple authors that were collected and then merged together into the text, and that Moses didn't necessarily write these. And as you become a more skilled scholar, a more skilled student of the text, you become comfortable with this. And once you become comfortable with just accepting that Moses didn't write the Torah, things begin to make more sense. You have less difficulty accepting the Bible as a document that records some history. It makes a lot of theological claims, and it's up to you whether or not you want to accept those. But it actually records a lot of history. Some of it, archaeology, you know, uh, disputes or rebut, but some of it seems to be pretty reliable. But if you don't accept the documentary hypothesis, you are, I think, forced to attempt to accept or reject a lot of things that science has demonstrated. And so I would say I encourage you, go read Baden's book.
Yeah, it's called The Composition of the Pentateuch, Reviewing the Documentary Hypothesis. I
Right.
would definitely say if you're interested in a starting point, he does a good job of introducing
Right.
the topics and then also giving a couple examples of stories associated with these and how can you see these coming together. So if you're looking for a good starting point with this, I definitely recommend it too.
Right. It's not on my shelf here. It's on my shelf in my other office. Um, but don't be afraid. Even if you're a confessional person, if you're a person of faith, don't fear accepting the documentary hypothesis. Just understand that the Hebrew Bible was written over a period of time from different viewpoints, and that the Jewish tradition valued that and preserved that, and that was a good thing.
Jumping off of the back of that, valuing, preserving, and asking some questions, part two of Joseph's question is there any evidence of the Exodus? So an archaeological focus here, maybe if we limit ourselves to,
Yeah.
we've talked text, let's talk archaeology on this one.
Right.
Do we have archaeological evidence for the Exodus?
Well, this is the greatest hits of things that you can yell at Bob about, huh? I got asked this once at a retreat for people who were very interested in biblical archaeology. And I said, we have lots of evidence for the context of the Exodus. We don't really have evidence for the Exodus itself. Now, a wagon wheel, a chariot wheel at the bottom of a body of water isn't evidence of an Exodus, right? That's evidence that there was a lot of maritime trade on bodies of water, which we know there were. Some people will say, well, a nomadic people going across a desert won't leave a lot of it. Okay,
Right.
that's fair. But you're arguing again from a negative, right? You're saying, well, we don't have any evidence, but we shouldn't expect it. So we have nothing, but so
that should
absence of
confirm
evidence.
that we had a nomadic group because we have nothing.
Correct. Absence of evidence is an evidence of absence, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that we have little or no evidence of an Exodus isn't where I like to argue this from. I like to point out we don't have that. What I like to point out is within the Hebrew Bible, we've got conflicting dates for when this Exodus would have happened based upon the dates that we have, coming out of, they call these cities Ramesses and Pithom, and they versus when they say the establishment of the temple was, and when they're describing that going back. This is why among confessional people who believe there was an Exodus, you have the early Exodus people and the late Exodus people. I think I've talked about this in a previous video. If I have, I'll put the link in the description below. If not, we need to make that video.
If not, we can make
I've
a topic. Well,
discussed it in class after.
This is a
I lecture
topic
on it
that
every semester.
Yeah, this is going to be alive in and of itself in the future as well as the
Yeah,
question of
we'll
archaeology
do
and the
the
evidence.
questions
But
of the Exodus.
our short answer here is no.
Nobody, I would say there's no evidence of it. Most critical scholars will reject this, despite the claims of some people to have found the route of the Exodus, and no. The accepted evidence, I would argue now, is that the people who call themselves the Israelites today, or, in the Bible, the people who call themselves the Israelites in the Bible, God, that makes me very old today. The people who come to be known as the Israelites in the Bible were Canaanites. They were always there, right? So when you have this list of Canaanites, when you have the Merneptah stele, right, it talks about, Merneptah's going up and bragging about all these people he whooped around, and he knocked out the walled peoples, right? Gezer and these people. and these people who were just kind of out in the countryside. He talks about defeating Israel and puts them as a people marker, not as a landed people or a city marker. So we know that Israel was there in the 13th century BC because Merneptah's bragging about, wiping out Israel. Its seed is no more or something. He's bragging
Yeah.
about them. Dictators tend to brag about things that they've done, whether they've done them or not. So we've got that evidence of these Israelites being these Canaanite people. Now people will say, well, yeah, but that was the period of the judges, and that was after they conquered the land. We can go back all the way back to Kathleen Kenyon's research at Jericho when, the walls were destroyed, but they were destroyed a couple hundred years before any Israelites would have come in there. They probably saw the destroyed walls and they made that part of their foundation myth. Two other sites that were claimed to have been destroyed. We don't really see the pottery break. We have evidence that they would have flowed into cities and out of cities into the land, but that the people that became the Israelites were always there. They were Canaanites. They were one of these groups, from the Phoenicians to all of these other Canaanite groups, that were always there in the land. That was their land. And that the story of them going down to Egypt and then coming out to Egypt is part of the foundation myth. And we have these, right? We have these for the Romans, right? Romulus and Remus. By the way, Romulus and Remus placed in a basket, placed in a river. We have foundation myths for the Assyrian people, right? What happens to, is it Sargon? What happens to Sargon? He's placed in a basket and placed in a river, and that's how he's protected as he. So
It's just
we
an
have
extremely normal thing.
it's
Babies
a
in
normal
baskets and
thing
rivers happens every day.
for a young ruler who's going to become the founder of a great people
Yes.
to be placed in a basket in a river and floated down. So it appears that the Exodus story is part of it. Now it's a wonderful story, and it's the underlying story behind Passover, and it's a beautiful tradition, and I love this story, and I love to tell the story, and it's so powerful. But it appears to be part of a foundation myth. The other thing is, when we look archaeologically, it looks like Judah in the south and Egypt were allies. I mean, we have this in Hezekiah when the Rav Shaka comes in and says, what, are you going to rely on that broken reed? You're going to rely on Egypt again? Look at all of the scarabs, look at all of the archaeological evidence going way back. Judah and Egypt were allies. They weren't, sworn enemies. They were allies for most of their early existence, and you have this proto-Sinaitic tech.
There's
There was a
connections.
lot of
There's
yeah, there
lots
was
of
a lot of
connections.
more congruency that you have with Egypt than we have in the Exodus, and so that's the long way of saying no. The Exodus is likely a foundation myth. People don't like it when I use that. Let's call it a foundation story. But the archaeological evidence says that the people who became the Israelites, who were the ancestors of the people who became the Judahites, who became the Jews, were always there. That's their indigenous homeland.
A pre-submitted question here coming from a supporter. So thank you. Again, Patreon is there should you so wish to join up. You can send questions in advance that we'll get to in lives. Does the Bible say anything about dinosaurs? And if so, are there any examples of dinosaurs in the Bible?
I would have to say no. There are people who like to point at Leviathan
Yeah.
and Behemoth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who, is this possible? Could that be an alligator and a hippo? And are those, ancestors to dinos? We have a mention of a unicorn, right, in the King James. So why
Yeah.
can't there be dinosaurs?
Well, and fun,
No,
this is why Scotland, fun sidebar, why Scotland's symbol is the unicorn, because the lion can't slay it. So the English lion can't slay the unicorn. Your King James sidebar for the day. But back to dinosaurs.
is that a true story?
Yeah. Yeah.
Really? I didn't
Yeah,
know
so
that. Okay, so I
there are
learned
these
something.
great tapestries about like the capturing of the unicorn, and unicorn becomes, it's a part of, right, this Scottish imagery, but because it, in the King James version, there's the unicorn and it can't be slayed by the lion, and England's symbol, right, is that lion. So it's one of those
No
Scottish,
kidding.
we're going to get one up on you here. But King James has influenced many things, so unsurprised
Yeah,
there.
yeah, no, it has.
But yeah,
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 no, with the dinosaurs, look, there's a lot of people today who don't accept them. And then there's another group of people who put people writing on the back of them because they have to do this 6 day creation, 6,000 year. The earth has been around for a very, 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 very long time. This is what the scientific evidence tells us. Um, there are dinosaurs, there were dinosaurs, but the Bible really doesn't speak to that because it really can't. Um, so just because the Bible doesn't speak to something doesn't mean it didn't exist. And I say this right after talking about the Exodus, right? But just because it doesn't speak to something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And just because it does talk about something doesn't mean that it did.
hmm
But we really don't have any evidence for the dinos.
Can I ask a
The
follow up?
Leviathan and the Behemoth reference might be talking about deities,
Yeah.
might be talking about mythological beasts, like with the cherubs that we always read about the cherubs in the Bible.
hmm
And it might be talking about actual animals like a hippo or an alligator or something that they can't explain, so they mention them.
Can I ask a follow up question here that usually gets connected with this idea of dinosaurs in the Bible
Sure.
having to do with the flood? Right? A common argument of
Hmm.
what's going on, why do the dinosaurs get wiped out? The
Hmm.
flood, but also this idea of are there then dinosaurs? If there have to be dinosaurs, are there dinosaurs on the ark or not? Are these creatures on the ark? Can you speak a little bit here to the this is connecting to our documentary hypothesis question with the kinds and 2 and 7. How does that idea get connected with the flood here?
Uh, I want to recommend a video of a friend of mine who goes by the name of Non-Stamp Collector, and we won't go into why his name is Non-Stamp Collector, but he does a great two-part video on the flood. You can go on YouTube right now, Non-Stamp Collector, all one word, and he does a classic video treatment of the problems with the flood, and he does it from a comical standpoint. But it's a he always makes fun of his own animation. I love his animation, but he talks about not only the problems of bringing all of these animals in, how on earth would Noah get, and they've changed all the names since I learned them growing up, but a brontosaurus, a T-Rex. But then also, how do you feed these things? Because remember, you're supposed to take enough food for these animals for the 90 days or however long it was. No, no. No, you don't. And okay, but he gave them a soothing and put them to sleep. And some of these things eat the other animals, and there's only two. And how do you? And is a dinosaur clean or an unclean animal? I can't remember.
I mean, I would think it's connected with the lizards and the reptiles, so it's gonna be coming in
Yeah.
as
So
unclean and
yeah, so
lots
no,
of there's more problems. Dinos on the ark,
no.
no dinos.
I
And
I've
that
got
kind question is usually how this goes, right? Like according to their
yeah.
kind. So maybe a dinosaur sneaks
Well,
on the
that's
ark because
another
it's a
whole nother
baby and it's a different thing. But we can come back to that topic
this
on
this
another
whole
day.
thing that it was only the kind, the primordial kind, because evolution didn't take place before the flood, but once you bring the kind, the bear kind, and then once they get off, then evolution can take place after they get off the boat, and you get all the different kinds of bears from that principal kind. No, evolution takes place or it doesn't take place. It doesn't start taking place, in the few thousand years since the flood. I mean, no, there's a lot of, I call this mental gymnastics, right? There's a lot of people who do these mental backflips to try to make this possible scientifically. It's not. It's a story. It's a story like Gilgamesh. It's a story like these other flood traditions. And no, it doesn't match. These are classic, beautiful literature stories that have been compiled because that was the best knowledge that they had at the time. They collected these stories. They didn't know they were about the times before they lived, so they put them at the beginning of their book. The creation stories go at the beginning. They have this flood story. They put that there. How did we speak all these different languages? Okay, let's tell a story about that. Why is there a rainbow in the sky? Okay, let's tell a story about that. Why are there these big, tall salt pillars on the Dead Sea? Let's tell a story about that. These are called etiological stories, uh, uh, explanations for otherwise naturally occurring phenomena. So that's what a lot of these early stories are. And they're beautiful. They're wonderful stories. And, and within these stories, the Israelites, the Jewish peoples, the Hebrew tradition, couched in them morals, ethics, things that would tell their people about who they were, where they came from, what they believed. And that's why we tell stories, right? I have 5 kids, and I tell these guys, instead of just telling them, stop doing that, I will sometimes craft a story. Let me tell you a story. And I'll craft the story in such a way so that they want to be like the kid who does the right thing. Oh, I guess I better choose this. That's a way that we've done this since there's been humans, right? Jesus told parables.
Yeah.
Do you think those parables really happened? Do you think Jesus was a peeping Tom looking in the window of a woman who lost one of her 10 coins? And no, he made that story up. But he made the story up to, we tell stories, we make stories up, but it's in order to convey some kind of tradition, some kind of ethics, some kind of morals. And that's what these are.
Got a question from the live here, and I'm gonna limit you on this one. Can you give me three? They're looking for introductory books to biblical archaeology. Could you give a top three for somebody looking to get their feet wet here? Where would you say is a good place to start?
Yeah, and let me. I see here. I got a shout out from Joseph. So Joseph Arroyo, you bet. Thank you. Also shout out to Tammy for joining Patreon. Thank you very much. Tammy has been a longtime fan, so shout out to Tammy for joining up. The book that I recommend, the book that I've assigned in class before for people who come and say, "Hey, where do I start with biblical archaeology?" is my colleague Eric Klein's a very short intro to biblical archaeology. It's a short. I think it's an Oxford, little Oxford. These short introductions.
Mm-hmm.
Go grab that. Go grab Eric Klein. Eric Klein's been doing this since way before I was born. No, I won't make him that old. But Eric Klein's been doing this for a long time. He knows how to write for the public. And so if you pick up this book, and I got to look on Amazon here to see how much this is. I don't think it's a big I don't think it's an expensive book. I think it's under $20, and you can pick this up and he will walk you through kind of the history and the basic principles of biblical archaeology. That would be one that I'd start with. There is a Zondervan makes a handbook of biblical archaeology. It's a little older, and one of the issues with these is it oftentimes brings into its discussion theories that not all critical scholars accept, but there is the Zondervan Handbook of Biblical Archaeology. Um, Jody Magnus has a book that came out. I'm trying to think. I'm looking forward here in the top. I've assigned it as a textbook in my class before, and I'm trying to. Let me just type in her name here. I want to get the exact name. Da, 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 da. The Archaeology of the Holy Land, from Destruction of Solomon's Temple to the Muslim Conquest. This is a thick book, but it's called The Archaeology of the Holy Land from the Destruction of the Solomon's Temple. Now, this is not necessarily an introduction. It's a very thorough reading, but I would recommend this book. Yeah, it's going to get everything. And I always like to at least recommend Cities of the Bible. It's a little different approach.
Yep.
But it's about how we got the Bible that we have today by just looking at some of the main cities that are in the region and some of the archaeology that comes out of that. So if you're interested in how the Bible came to be, I would recommend that book, or Bill Schniedewen's How the Bible Became a Book. Bill Schniedewen's a very good scholar out of UCLA, and he wrote a book called How the Bible Became a Book. So I would recommend those, but start with Eric Klein's very short introduction.
And I'll tag one more onto our list of three here.
Mm-hmm.
A great book edited by Cynthia Schaefer Elliott, The 5-Minute Archaeologist. This is, it's not so much, every site, but if you're looking for questions about why archaeologists do what they do, how they do what they do, it's a series of short pieces meant to be read in 5 minutes. From all kinds of different scholars. So that's a great, if you have questions about what do archaeologists do and why, The 5-Minute Archaeologist is definitely a good pickup as well.
And I know I'm going to get a flood of emails from my colleagues who are going to say, hey, What about my book? So we need to put together a list
We should
for
make
the
a
Bible and
list.
Archaeology
Yes.
website where we have here's our recommended books for introduction to the Bible and to biblical archaeology. So you and I need to work on that afterwards, but that would be a good resource that we can put either on YouTube or on the website. But
The
thanks
list
for the
is long.
question. Yeah, it's a but a good vetted list
Hmm.
of here are the books that have responsible scholars talking about good archaeology. By the way, anything by Oded Lipschitz, uh, again, a bit more technical, but very thorough archaeology. Anything by Professor Lipschitz and Yuval Godot is writing a lot of and doing a lot of this archaeology coming out of there. Lots of sites. So anything by them, I would absolutely recommend.
Another pre-submitted question here, similar to dinosaurs, but not quite. Another is there evidence? Is there evidence for? Are there examples of aliens in Ezekiel or other books of the Bible? This person's been told that there are examples of aliens in Ezekiel. Where does this come from? They're not totally sure what this is going on. So could you get some? They're looking for some background here, some insight.
Sure, and apparently I'm the guy to ask about aliens, right?
Yeah, I hear that.
Um,
I hear that you're the guy to ask about aliens.
so we'll tell the story of how I ended up on Ancient Aliens some other time. But
Yeah.
so I, as the debunker on Ancient Aliens, as the guy who went on that show to say, it's not aliens. I'm also the first one to concede, A, there might be life out there, and it's most likely doing the same things we are. It's at a place where they can't possibly get to us, and they're going, I wonder if there's anybody else out there. A. And B, what I've done on that show before is say, I can understand how people in antiquity and how people today uh, could believe in people from outer space, or let's say otherworldly beings. A, people today believe in otherworldly beings, not just aliens, but in deities, right? People today believe that there are beings or entities that are not human, that exist, that control or have an impact on the world. Call them demons, spirits, gods, whatever you want to call them.
Mm-hmm.
So the belief in those things makes it very difficult to debunk or disprove the belief in aliens, because the same arguments that are used to debunk aliens are often used to debunk or disprove deities and angels and things like that. It's the same, it's basically the same line of argumentation. So this is why a lot of confessional people who don't necessarily believe in aliens don't make it a point to go out and argue against aliens, because they believe in the gods or a god and angels and things like that. So that's why this alien thing persists among people of faith. That said, you can understand how somebody reading a text in Ezekiel today about America, right, or some kind of being the scene of vision, especially Ezekiel, where you've got these apocalyptic visions.
Mm-hmm.
How you could imagine Genesis 6, 1 through 4, these Nephilim.
Right.
How you could imagine that a being that is not human, that the Bible says is a son of God, so it's not human, it's a deity, it's a deity that exists other than God, right? It says
Mm-hmm.
it's a son of God, so it's not human, but it exists separate from God, that God created it. If it were a Greek tradition, we would just call it a god, right? Because there are multiple gods, but since it's a monotheist tradition, we call it something else. And that in the text, it says that they came down and had sex with human women and created these giants that started to screw up the earth.
Talking about the Nephilim here in Genesis.
But these are the Nephilim and the giants and these fallen angels,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have an entire Enochic tradition, these
Right.
tradition about these giants, and you
The
have it at
Watchers
Qumran,
and
right? Right. The Watchers, the Urim, right? You have all these guys that you could see how a group back then and how a group today would look at that and say, oh, that wasn't their belief in angels. Those were aliens. right? That they saw something, right? Because you accept that they saw something and were accurately reporting about it, and it must have been real, but you reject that it was a son of God, right? Could maybe because you only believe there's one son of God, Jesus, right? So it must have been something else. So it must have been an alien and they just misrepresented it. So I can understand how people can get there. I just don't think that it's aliens. I don't think that I think that these are traditions of giants, just like the flood tradition that got incorporated into the Bible. I think that Ezekiel had visions. And just because he had a vision doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that he saw was real. I have dreams, right? But I wake up and I don't think, oh, this is a real thing. I had a dream, right? And that's a dream. Doesn't make it real. But if I write the dream down, maybe someone will one day think, oh, he saw a real thing.
With eyes in its armpits and look in every
Right,
direction
right.
and
And four
faces heading
faces
and
and right and it's it's got wings and
little
covering up
green
stuff.
creatures on UFOs. Ezekiel is not
No,
describing, but some kind
no.
of non-human life form
And
is
let
what
me
he's.
state once again for the record, since I've stated this before, I have a big problem with the belief that, and let me just come out and say it, that um, essentially everything that all these structures that were built in countries that the skin color of the peoples are a little bit darker, pyramids, Machu Picchu, all of the Nazca lines, all this stuff, that those had to be produced by aliens. But a lot of the things that have been produced by cultures that have lighter colored skin, well, that was produced by the humans. That's you can see how and I don't want to use the word racism, but you can
I
see
think it's
how
fair.
this that creeps into this that oh, that can't possibly have been done by the people. They were primitive peoples. They didn't know how to do so. But the counter argument to the racist argument, and I get it. I have a problem with that because I don't believe that aliens made any of this stuff. But the counter argument is that was in every culture's literature, right? From how did humans learn the ability to smelt metals, right? To learn how to make fire, makeup, and stuff. Well, in the Hebrew tradition, in Enoch, right, they learned that from these deities that fell out of the sky. So even in the Hebrew tradition, you have these texts that saying, "Oh no, we didn't get that from learning and through evolution and cultural, adaptation of prior knowledge." We got it from the gods, right? We learned how to make fire because they weren't supposed to divulge that. You have that in every tradition that the knowledge was coming from above and it was forbidden knowledge and we weren't
Right.
supposed to know that. So we on the one hand we see these things and we're like, yeah, let's not attribute it to aliens because that doesn't give credit to humanity that should receive credit in every culture around the world for the things that they did in their history, their cultural heritage. Let's not deny that. But let's also acknowledge that each of these cultures has stories that looked to the heavens and said, "Yeah, we got this from up there." But it wasn't aliens; it was just their part of their cultural heritage that they got this from the gods.
And this argument has recently taken, well, not new. I mean, Graham Hancock has been doing this for a while, but gotten some new legs. And Graham Hancock's Netflix series with this like human idea that travels around. So this unfortunately this claim isn't really going anywhere anytime
Now, it's
soon. But yeah,
again
there's problems. There's problems abounding here. Yeah.
the same argument that's used to deny the aliens. That same line of reasoning is used to deny deities, and a lot of people are uncomfortable arguing against God, so they just let the aliens one slip. I just want to warn people that it looks very bad when you try to argue that aliens produced the pyramids and the Nazca lines, but here in America or in Europe, with the exception of Stonehenge, right? That's clearly that was aliens, right? But no, but the European stuff that was the product of hard work. But all of these other things were the product of aliens. Be careful when you argue that because it's not a good look.
Speaking in, I guess, a question here to end us off, dealing still with that heavenly realm coming from the chat. What is your take on why there would be allowed a zodiac sign in a Jewish synagogue
Mm.
in Israel? So this is, what is it? It's they're asking about Hamat Devaria. So that synagogue with the full zodiac. It's a great place to visit if you have the chance. There's a good little animation that goes through and kind of shows some of these different things. But why is there zodiac symbols? Why is there a full zodiac inside the synagogue? Allowed, not allowed? Why?
You actually have this in a lot of synagogues at
Yeah.
the time. And I mean, the simplest answer would be it is a product of, it demonstrates the extent of Hellenization of Judaism at the time. Now, did the Jewish tradition, did the archaeology, were they already looking to the stars? Were they already incorporating an understanding of, I mean, maybe they got it from the Babylonians, who knows? But they already understood the divisions of times, right? They're writing jubilees, and they're already working out this division of time. But by the time that they've got this Hellenized Judaism, what we call Hellenization, this is fully incorporated. Whether it's the Mona Lisa of Sepphoris, right? This beautiful panel mosaic that actually shows the drinking contest between Heracles and Bacchus,
Mm-hmm.
the strongest guy and the biggest frat guy on versus the god of wine. And I like the last panel where it just shows Heracles throwing up and it just says methe, right? Drunk, right? Or, whether it's a zodiac in a synagogue and it's got the all of the different the what are they called? The
The zodiac
constellations.
symbols, yeah, all the constellations are
Yeah,
represented
it's
in
got
it.
all the constellations, and then it's got Helios in the middle, right? Pulling the chariot, pulling the sun across the center in one of these, and it's in the center of the synagogue. And it, it its presence there, people say, well, this is paganism, run amok, and it shows how liberal. No, I think it just demonstrates how accepted, how just normal, just like today, right? I see a horoscope in the paper, and I don't throw the paper and cancel my. This is just a thing that goes on, and it was just an accepted part of it. It was just a decoration. It was something that was just accepted part of Hellenistic Judaism. I don't think they necessarily worshipped it. I don't think. I'm sure that there's some people who argue this. There are some people that study Qumran that think that there was some sun worship, sun activity going on there. But I just think that this is one of those things in Hellenistic Judaism that just became a normalized part of the culture. Is this there are divisions among the year, and these divisions are represented by these constellations. You can see them. It doesn't mean that they're deities. It doesn't mean that they're worshiping them, but this is how it's represented in our larger culture. So this is how we represent it here. By the way, we're still going to read that Torah up at the front of the synagogue. That's what we're here to worship. But these are our decorations.
I think that's a great place to leave off our Question Friday. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and submitting your questions. This is something we're looking to do each month. So if you have questions in advance that you're wanting to send in, if you're not able to join live, go ahead and do that. You can always leave questions in the comments from previous videos. We look through those. But we look forward to seeing you next week for another live, a topic that'll be announced this coming week. But thank you for joining us today. Bob, anything you want to say to wrap us up?
No, I noticed that we're both wearing Hawkeye gear.
Go
So
Hawks.
yeah, go Hawks. And for all the rest of you, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jordan, for leading us in the discussion. And for all of you, thank you for being a part of this, and everything the best.